So the question is that I've been asked is, can narcissistic people have a fawn response? Or do they fawn? And the short answer is yeah. Fawning is a trauma response. It's involuntary. And the fact is, many people who have narcissistic personalities have their own histories of trauma and adversity. So it would stand to reason that yes, absolutely, a person with a narcissistic personality, a person with any personality, can and will fawn. Not all will, but many. So let's just go back to basics. And for more than basics, I by no means am any expert here. I really highly recommend that you read Dr. Ingrid Clayton's brilliant book on fawning. The link for her book is in the show notes. It's a really good companion manual to It's Not You. But fawning, in broad strokes, is a trauma response. And our trauma responses are involuntary nervous system responses that are designed to foster safety for us, right? And it's in essence, our bodies, our survival instinct is kicking in. In Dr. Clayton's book, she shares that fawning is sort of a hybrid trauma responses of what we call hypo and hyper arousal. Hypo, sort of lower arousal, means a sort of numbing or even dissociation. That's sort of the self-abandoning part of fawning. We disconnect from ourselves, which is very much what happens when we don't feel safe. Because frankly, it's not safe to be ourselves in a moment where we feel triggered or activated or with a certain kind of a person or a person who's behaving in a certain way or our history with them. Then that mixes with a hyper-aroused part, right? A part of us that does something. Traditionally, for example, the fight response is a hyper-aroused response because we may do something, react, whatever, but we do something to get safe. The hyper-aroused part of the fawn response is that we actually engage with the threat. It's usually a person, right? We may laugh at their jokes. We may not pull away from them. We may sit there while they say or even do things that make us uncomfortable. We are engaging with the harmful person, right? But in a way that is disengaged from our true selves. The way we may engage during the fawn response, in a way sort of may at a very somatic deep level, it's like we're trying to calm the situation or avoid danger. But none of this is happening at a thinking level. It's happening at a felt level. Now, narcissistic people tend to favor the fight response as a trauma response, right? Narcissistic personality styles are antagonistic and they can be quite belligerent. So under conditions of perceived threat by the narcissistic person, and narcissistic people often perceive threats, including in close relationships, they're much more likely to lash out. Fight response. But it doesn't mean that other trauma responses, such as the fawn response or the freeze response, won't happen. A narcissistic person is likely to fawn with someone, maybe someone who has power, the power to harm them, or perhaps the power to dent their grandiose defenses, or that is just triggering in some way that's specific to that narcissistic person. Some examples could be for a narcissistic person who's fawning with a boss, or they've met someone famous or renowned or friends with them, or with a powerful family member who can make things happen for them or also shut stuff down for them. Or a powerful person that has qualities or behaviors that are reminiscent of abusers from other times in their life. For example, the narcissistic person may have been a child who would fawn in the face of risk and harm, for example, with a harmful parent. And like anyone, any of us who have engaged in the fawn response, there may be a sense of shame about that in adulthood. However, the tricky piece here is shame very quickly turns into rage in the narcissistic personality, right? And it is very likely that this could be part of the self-origin story of the grandiosity needing to offset the self-loathing that is always bubbling inside the narcissistic person. The shame at looking back for that narcissistic person, to look back at their child fawn response with a harmful adult or a bully or other overpowering person in their lives. Now, if they could see that with compassion, if any of us can see that with compassion, that's how we heal. But that kind of vulnerability is far less likely to happen for a narcissistic person, especially if they do not get into therapy or they don't stick it out in therapy. Remember, The fawn response is involuntary. This is not something we're doing on purpose or by design. It's not the times that the narcissistic person is doing a sales job on someone and complimenting them to get something out of them. In that case, when the narcissistic person's doing the salesy thing to win someone over, the narcissistic person may have the power or may have a clearer agenda than the other person. That is not the fawn response. It looks like fawning, but it's to get something for them. Now, the challenge with the narcissistic fawn response is the fallout for the other people. I often think that the situation we sometimes observe of a narcissistic person who may be having fawn responses in the workplace, for example, they may have a shame activation within themselves that results in coming home and raging at the spouse or the children at home who did nothing to deserve that response by the narcissistic person. This displacement may originate from this kind of a source, whereas a person who is not narcissistic would be more likely to feel further shame, disconnection, anxiety, sadness in the wake of having fawn responses during the workday, and far less likely to take it out on their family members, their partner, or their kids when they get home later that day. The fawn response in the narcissistic person, even though they probably ain't fawning with you, they may be, but it's real. I mean, the fawn response is real for a narcissistic person. I've had the experience of having some narcissistic people fawn with me. And the one thing I noticed, and some of these happened recently, the one thing I noticed is that when they didn't get the responses or attention that they wanted, right? I was busy with something else, so I couldn't put my attention on them. They became enraged. In fact, probably more enraged than the sort of average narcissistic disappointment. And it seems that that whole sequence was likely fueled by the shame of their fawn response, right? So it's quite possible that if you were ever on the receiving side of a narcissistic fawn response, you may have also experienced disproportionate rage afterwards. And if you have some form of power in the situation, which you probably do, if the narcissistic person was fawning, right, then what might have happened is it was likely more of the passive-aggressive, sort of withdrawing rage with a dangling threat of something more overt to come, more of a, how dare you ignore me or not appreciate me? They may not say that part out loud. And then they'll go quiet and sullen. But they may say like, if you mess me up again, you let me down like this, I'm going to call my lawyer, or whatever their threat may be, right? It's always like, you are not going to make me feel small. It's very much the narcissistic ultimate response. Now, the narcissistic fawn response could be part of those sorts of the many different ways that narcissistic people are able to sort of show up in the world. They may seem smart, wise, fun, charming, charismatic, even gentle with some people, and then quite cruel and manipulative with other people. Now, this is not always the case. Those episodes of treating some people well and others badly can be quite intentional. Be charming on the golf course with the boss, be fun and flirty with the attractive person at the gym, and then come home and treat you badly. But at times, those kinds of multiple ways of being in the world could be part of the fawn response. And however, this is the tricky part. Knowing all of this, I'm not so sure that it helps survivors. And it could even get you caught in a rough cycle where you may feel bad for the narcissistic person who still has these responses in the wake of their own difficult history. But if you brought it up to them and said, hey, I can see you're having a fawn response, a trauma response with your boss. And then you come home and you're not nice to me. And I get that that is your trauma response to feel safe. You know what I got to say to you if you do that? I'd tell you right now, pick the dressing for the gaslighted word salad. that you would be eating for dinner and probably the rest of the week. You know that's not going to work. It's too simplistic to say that everyone in a relationship with someone who has a narcissistic personality is simply caught in a perpetual fawn response. It's not that simple. There is a spectrum of response, and it can depend on the type of narcissism you're dealing with, the severity of the personality and their behavior, your own personal history of trauma and other difficult relationships. While the fawn response is very common in narcissistic relationships and is often part and parcel of the self-abandonment that happens as part of being in these relationships, we may also see people who may freeze or flee, and some who may even fight. And then within one person, there can be different responses depending on the nature of their history of trauma and adversity and disruptions in safety and attachment and the trigger or issue that they're facing in their current life. You know, it's not that simple. There's a lot of moving parts to this. Now, what is challenging is that many people who find themselves in narcissistic relationships, especially since these may be people who are important to us, partners, spouses, parents, siblings, friends, many people in these relationships will find any way to dig into empathy, awareness that this response, that all trauma response comes out of a very scared and safety-seeking place. That's a very humane view, but it's not a view that you can engage the narcissistic person with. Perhaps for you, it can shed a little light on some of what can feel like unexpected behavior in some circumstances by the narcissistic person, but is just a reminder that trauma affects us all differently and similarly. And when we have been harmed in a way that undercuts a sense of safety in a bigger way, life can become disproportionately focused on safety. Unfortunately, that sense of shame that kind of vulnerability brings up in narcissistic people can also mean that the rage that you're accustomed to can become even worse. So again, yes, narcissistic people can have the fawn response. And as I said, it can actually end up in a ramping up of rage in all kinds because it percolates through the sort of vulnerable filter, which doesn't feel good for the narcissistic person. But always remember, the fawn trauma response is very different than the other way we use the word fawning intentionally, like, oh, wow, that's such a cool car. That kind of intentional, kind of falling over ourselves, complimenting someone. Narcissistic people can be really good at that too, but that's very different than the reflexive fawn response that can happen, that disengaging from ourselves and yet continuing to engage with a harmful person. That's a universal. Yes, it can happen for narcissistic people, but the back end of that fawn response can look quite different. And while you can have empathy for somebody who's having that response in light of their own trauma, it cannot become an excuse for ongoing abuse in your relationship. Thanks again.